Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to our first plenary of the conference, the plenary session on queer natures, bodies, sexualities, environments. Just to remind you to be followed by a second plenary at 11 o'clock in the Shakespearean Futures Initiative. I'm very proud and honored to be moderating this session today. The format will be, we have 4 speakers. We'll be talking for about 15 minutes each, to be followed by an open discussion among the audience and the panelists. There are, I believe, one microphone there. There's not another microphone there? Okay, there's a microphone here. Since we're such a large group, it would help if audience members could use the microphone to ask questions. I'm going to be giving you a very, very brief introduction to our 4 accomplished speakers, which will not represent the scope of all of their scholarship, just to save time so that we have more time for discussion at the end of the session. So our first speaker today will be Joseph Campana. Joseph is Alan Dugald McKillop Chair and Associate Professor at Rice University. He's the author of The Pain of Reformation, Spencer, Vulnerability, and the Ethics of Masculinity, and editor with Scott Maisano of Renaissance Posthumanism. His talk today is Love in a Time of Swarm. Our second speaker is Vin Nardizzi, Associate Professor in English at the University of British Columbia. Vin is author of Wooden O's, Shakespeare's Theaters and England's Trees, and editor with Jean Feerick of The Indistinct Human in Renaissance Literature. His talk is on fruits and vegetables. Our third speaker is Karen Raber, who's professor of English at the University of Mississippi, author of Animal Bodies, Renaissance Culture, and editor of the book series for Routledge on the perspectives on the non-human in literature and culture. And her talk today is Equeer. And our fourth speaker is Laurie Shannon, who is Franklin Bliss Snyder Professor of English at Northwestern University, author of the books Sovereign Amity, Figures of Friendship in Shakespearean Cultures, and more recently of The Accommodated Animal, Cosmopolity in Shakespearean Locales. And her talk today is on nature's changing course, the question of Sonnet 18. So please join me in welcoming our 4 speakers.
Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here with my colleagues. I want to thank Karen Raber for putting this all together. I also want to say it's really nice to be presenting at a hotel that's also hosting a zoology conference, which I learned when I got here. And when I did a little bit of light internet stalking to try to figure out if I could sneak into some sessions there, I discovered it was also Furry Weekend Atlanta this weekend. If you don't know what a furry is, ask a neighbor. Okay. This is Love in a Time of Swarm. So much, so much depends on figure, although not, in this case, William Carlos Williams' exquisite conjuration of Georgic simplicity, a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. Here I consider instead the continual motion of honeybees celebrated in Henry V, or bees in springtime swarming forth from populous hives in Paradise Lost, as particularly illuminating figures for our purposes today. But first, what is, or better yet, what figures queer ecologies or queer natures? Of late, and with reference to the intersection of these once provocatively, though perhaps now frustratingly capacious terms, queer, nature, ecology, a series of charismatic figures have arisen: mesh, tangle or fold, and arguably the primal eldest, web. Building on the ecological thought while borrowing his central term from Eve Sedgwick's essay Queer and Now, Timothy Morton in the now widely cited Queer Ecology argues, quote, that life forms constitute a mesh, a non-totalizable, open-ended concatenation of interrelations that blur and confound boundaries at practically any level, between species, between the living and the non-living, between organism and environment. Thus ecology, in another quote, demands intimacy with other beings that queer theory also demands in another key. What Morton finds in organisms and objects, Karen Barad takes to the quantum level in Meeting the Universe Halfway, and other essays, including one called Queer Performativity, in which she describes the constitutive, another quote, entanglement of subject and object, and the resulting, quote, responsibility to the entanglements of which we are a part, which produces a kind of definitional and figural explosion later in that essay. And this is another quote. Queer is itself a lively mutating organism, a desiring radical openness, an edgy protean differentiating multiplicity, an agential disk/continuity, an enfolded, reiteratively materializing, promiscuously inventive spatiotemporality. Mesh, tangle, and fold lean on the older notion of a web of life, which was common enough to provide the governing concept for John Storr's 1953 primer, The Web of Life, a first book of ecology, which describes for a young general reader the interrelationships characteristic of an ecological point of view. Capra's influential 1996 The Web of Life rebrands the figure for an age of deep ecology and a systems theory approach that addresses, quote, the highly integrative systems of life, which Jason Moore's 2015 recent Capitalism in the Web of Life foregrounds. So much of late depends on webs and folds and meshes, because from them arise the contours of a sensibility, a shifting constellation of the perverse and the polyvocal, the intimate and the interdependent, all of which seem to be valorized in increasingly mandatory and often aspirational aphoristic appeals to ever more elusive and implied political gains. And yet the perverse might not be polyvocal, nor polyvocality perverse, just as interdependency need not be intimate, nor intimacy a sign of interdependence. Moreover, in spite of decades of work queering the natural and thereby exposing the troubling invocation of a totalizing nature that justifies and enforces norms, we may now be in the odd position of having substituted a more politically palatable set of pluralizing ideals for seemingly more restrictive norms. Has a loop statement of naturalization arisen in the insistence that we're perverse, polyvocal, intimate, and interconnected because systems biology, deep ecology, and subatomic particles tell us so? Rather than web, tangle, or mesh, I turn here to hive and swarm, complex and ambivalent figures of collectivity, which focus attention on mutually illuminating dilemmas of polity and sexuality in early modernity, and of queer ecologies or natures in our own era. Hives might be intimate and interconnected, and yet Hive also names a tendency, of which we have been rightly suspicious, to a hyperstructured polity, ruthless functional differentiation, and imposing sovereign architecture, all of which might imply commonality or tyranny, community or totalization. Swarm might seem to name perverse polyvocality, but it also names both the destructive counter-tendency to sovereign order and a reproductive patterning that lent habitation and name to colonial logic as early as early America. But first, bees. Creatures, we learn in Henry V, that by a rule in nature teach the act of order to a peopled kingdom. A bee was a certain kind of figure, at least in part. It is a pattern to men, Charles Butler insists, in his 1609, The Feminine Monarchy, which was, if not the parent and original of early modern English bee books, then nonetheless the exemplary early modern instance. Butler did not, of course, originate the ancient ideal, old by the time Seneca insisted, apes ut aiunt debemus imitare, or we should, as they say, imitate the bees, an idea obvious given the successful career of apian analogy over millennia, and improbable because of the extraordinary gulf between bee and human. While a pattern to men suggests the gendered nature of exemplarity, it turns out to be more complex in the case of bees than the phrase might suggest. Perhaps it'll come as no surprise that Butler, royal beekeeper to Queen Elizabeth, would be the great proponent of the queen as opposed to the king bee. The sex of the master bee, as it was sometimes called, was one of several anxieties that this ideal and imitable apian order provoked. And here are some of those anxieties posed as questions. Did a queen or a king bee rule the hive? Are drones male or female? If they are male, are males then subject to a feminine monarchy or an Amazonian hierarchy in which they are not only lazy and useless, but seasonally banished or possibly murdered? Of course, by the women? If so, what implications arise from the proverbial exemplarity of bees? Do bees reproduce by copulation, corruption, egg-laying, or in some other, and this is a quote in a lot of these treatises, strange manner? All too easily, if understandably, concerns about sex and gender have tended to devolve on singular charismatic figures. The sovereign bee, conceived of as an individual who may or may not be he or she who decides the exception. The worker, the figure of industry par excellence that lends the hive its industrious exemplarity by being willing to work itself literally to death. And the drone, a figure of indolence, localized as either the lazy individual or a lazy class of individuals, say courtiers, whose seasonal expulsion guarantees hive survival. Attention to these figures, both in early modernity and our critical responses to it, tend to make one bee the unit of sexual and political measure. And yet, as Samuel Purchas puts it in his 1679 Theater of Political Flying Insects, one of the great titles of all books, una apia nulla apis. One bee is no bee, but a multitude, a swarm of bees. Collectivity, not individuality, governs here, drawing our attention to the creation, maintenance, and reproduction of hives and swarms more than of individuals. Articulations of ideal political order were a feature of early modern bee books, of course, but though such intimations were not without contradiction. According to Butler, and these are a few quotes from Feminine Monarchy, which I mentioned earlier, according to Butler, quote, bees abhor as well as polyarchy as anarchy, God having shown in them unto men an express pattern of a perfect monarchy, the most natural and absolute form of government. Monarchy though it may be, the beehive is also, another quote, a commonwealth, since all that they do is in common, without any private respect. Nihil norunt nisi commune. They work for all, they watch for all, they fight for all. In all appears a fracture, a familiar one, between the rhetoric of commonality and the binding agent of commonwealth, the figure of the sovereign. And this is Butler on that figure of the sort of sovereign bee. And all is under the government of one monarch, of whom above all things they have principal care and respect, loving, reverencing, and obeying her in all things. While she is well, they are cheerful about their work. If she droop, they faint also. If she die, they will never prosper, but thenceforth languish till they be dead. Many authors of many political persuasions, and you can track these across the many different bee books of the era, explore this absolute devotion, which John Levitt's ordering of the bees affirms with a citation from Virgil's Georgics. No creature more than the bee, quote, do so their king obey, who being safe and well, their minds are altogether one. The hive models what Jean-Luc Nancy calls in a provocative essay, Sexistence, a quote, totalitarian economy of love. For Richard Remnant, the totalizing drive extends fully into the realm of reproduction. This is a quote from Remnant's treatise. We note a strange insect beyond other creatures in that they know when to breed males and when females, and when to breed each, which is indeed wonderful, as also many other things in their commonwealth are, as their government and the manner of it, their comely order and valor, their labor and dainty work, their care and providence. The very notion of a commonwealth depends on a strange instinct and a powerful capacity to create an engineered totality in which the sex of the progeny is at the will of the collective, which is even more chilling than a more common articulation of gendered social engineering in the frequent, and to many authors disturbing, I've mentioned it already, annual purging of drones, by most authors assumed to be male, in the interest of sustaining a healthy hive. Many lavish disdain upon the drones for their indolence, in which case, yes, the purging was an extension of apian virtue, but even those who tried to imagine the utility of males, like Edmund Southern, observed this chilling practice. And when there are too many drones in a hive and that the bees perceive, as by nature they know, that they are hindered by them, then the bees of themselves will kill so many as they think good. The hive is a eugenic space engineered for ideal reproduction of a hive totality, not its charismatic individuals. Even basic advice about the care of hives reflected a sense of totality, as in the prefatory materials to John Warlich's 1675 Apiarium, which recommends, be sure not to plant anything near, your hives, nor do any act that may be offensive or heterogeneal to their natures. The hive is intimate and interconnected, but to what end? Hive might name the hatred of the heterogeneal and the danger of totalization, the fear not just that an individual monarch may be tyrant, or monarchy itself a form of tyranny, which was, of course, one of the great fault lines for conversations about sovereignty in this era. But Hive also seems to name the fear that any orientation around a core commons or community implies destructive homogenization. At the same time, this network of interconnected and mutually referencing bee books also witnesses the extreme political ambivalence of the hive. Butler and Rusden are particularly royalist, Rusden being Charles II's beekeeper, while John Day construes his hive as a parliament of bees, a place of active debate, dialogue, and parliamentary denunciation. While Thomas Moffat's Theater of Insects insists, bees are swayed by sovereignty, not tyranny. But neither do they admit of a king by succession or lot, but by due advice and circumspect choice. And although they willingly submit to regal authority, yet they retain their liberty. Hives might be Republican, Royalist, or somewhere in between, across bee books, or even within the very same text. Such constitutive ambiguity about nature's political paradigms cautions us about what Mary Bain Campbell, in a stellar essay on bees, calls the politically dangerous appeal to the moral authority of nature. Swarms, too, were figures of extreme ambivalence. Moffat, like others, treated the predictably destructive caterpillars that Shakespeare's Henry IV and VI both reviled. But more interesting is the closing note of swarm panic in the final entry of Earthworms, the entry called Of Earthworms. Having recounted destructive hordes of caterpillars earlier, there's little surprise to see pestilence strike again. Yet the entry recounts swarms of historical note from 970 and 1104. The latter, more prodigious swarms, quote, were seen diverse flying and flying worms in the air in such an infinite multitude that they darkened the light of the sun, seeming to deprive men's eyesight therefore. And shortly after this monstrous and unnatural wonder, there followed other strange and seldom seen prodigious sights on the earth. And what a boisterous storm of troubles, and raging whirlwind of war, and bloodshed shortly after ensued, the event whereof did plainly manifest. Depictions of bee swarms express a capacity for violent, anarchic rage, as in the angry swarm of the Amazonian Radegund, who afflicts Artegall and Talus in Spenser's legend of Justice. Manifest in such passages is a view of the swarm from the perspective of the hive, destructive anarchy, and a particularly early modern fear and fascination with vermin that extends beyond species, and that Lucinda Cole describes beautifully in her recent book, Imperfect Creatures. What made vermin dangerous was less their breed-specific cleverness or greed than their prodigious powers of reproduction through which individual appetites took on new collective power, especially in relation to uncertain food supplies. Swarm panic indulges a persecutory fantasy about insect life, sure, but the terrifying truth may be that swarms indicate appetite utterly indifferent to the human. I think indifference and asymmetry are things that are getting a little lost in some of our kind of invocation of interconnection lately. But even as celebratory accounts of swarms are hard to find in early modernity, swarms became, at a certain moment, the new black of contemporary political theory. In Multitude, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri addressed the conceptual problem of multiplicity, in work that's familiar to a number of us here, of course, preferring multitude to the people, the masses, the working class, or other ways of referring to political collectivities. While the concept of the people or the masses is one and reduces diversity to unity, the multitude, in contrast, is many. Hart and Negri imagine the multitude as a hopeful political solution to the dilemmas of empire, one that in realizing, quote, a democracy of the multitude comes into alignment with nature. One model for such a relationship derives from bees and flowers, which, I quote, suggests a society of mutual aid based on positive externalities and virtuous exchanges, in which the bees provide for the needs of the flower, and in turn the flower fulfills the bees' needs. It's hard not to hear intimations of apiologist Thomas Seeley's honeybee democracy, that's the name of his text, who finds in the swarming superorganism of the hive a perfect natural instance of community, in what he argues are a series of complex democratic debates amongst the scout bees about the location of the new hive. This is democracy in action, he thinks. More often than not, however, swarming in bee text concerns the multitudinous capacity for self-reproduction. Most of the early modern texts lavish attention on the seasonality of swarms, or offer advice for capturing rogue swarms, or encouraging more swarms in a season than you normally would get, both of which practices might double or triple the number of hives you have. Milton's famous epic simile, as bees in springtime when the sun with Taurus rides pour forth their populous youth about the hive, describes the first parliament of fallen angels, and it does so by marking the very moment in the life cycle of the hive when overpopulation provokes colonization. Was that the problem all along? Heaven was just too crowded? The buzz of Milton's fallen angels debating their fate might have cautioned Seeley about looking for easy democratic possibilities in nature, quote unquote. That swarms and swarm logic provide models for less savory technologies of war and commerce now makes it hard to ignore Eugene Thacker's cautionary comments about networks, swarms, and multitudes, which he describes as, quote, examples of mutations in the body politic that are structurally innovative but politically ambivalent. Structurally innovative, but politically ambivalent, what goes for perversely polyvocal swarms and intimate interconnected hives perhaps goes for any queer ecology. And Vincent Dupre's recent What Would Animals Say If We Asked the Right Questions conjures the horns of this very dilemma I've tried to talk about today. In an entry, the book is structured in terms of dictionary entries, in an entry entitled Queer, she affirms, nature is invited to a political project, a queer project. It teaches us nothing about who we are or what we ought to do, but it can feed our imagination and open our appetites for the plurality of usages and modes of being and existing. It never stops recombining categories and recreating from the multidimensionality of each and every one of them new modes of identity. It's a sentiment so stirring, she repeats it. Nature does not tell us what ought to be from what is. It can feed our imaginations, but not compel our actions. But advocacy for plurality does indicate what ought to be, as she herself suggests in an earlier entry called Impair. Do we not prefer a world that is marked by diversity? For variety is in the process of becoming a moral response, an abstract and all-terrain response, which indicates that we're going too fast and simply making variety into generality. In other words, variety is becoming a response rather than constituting a problem. At this moment in critical history, after a couple decades of queering nature, I think queer ecologies may be at risk of becoming merely a reflex, an all-terrain moral response, rather than constituting an invigorating problem. And while there's something visceral about the hope attached to meshes, tangles, and webs, we're all busy little bees, full of stings, making honey day and night in a world of hives and swarms. Thanks very much.
Hello. There we go. When asked to contribute to a session called Queer Natures, I could think of no more wholesome thing than fruits and vegetables to talk about. Have you had your recommended daily serving? There's always the luncheon. When I began to write this paper, I realized that I also needed flowers in the mix, so I've added them to my title as a garnish or buttonhole. All three kinds of plant, fruits, vegetables, and flowers are clustered in a peculiar way at the tragic high point of the play within a play in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Having recognized Pyramus's body, and after having tried to rouse him, Thisbe focuses attention on his face. This is her lament. These lily lips, this cherry nose, these yellow cowslip cheeks are gone, are gone. Lovers make moan, his eyes were green as leeks. In this unstageable blazon, a phrasing that reconfigures the title of a collection recently edited by Deborah Uman and Sarah Morrison, death seems to have sapped Pyramus's vitality from his face. This is, of course, a belated description, and so Pyramus's face no longer shines with the colors and shapes of these fruits, vegetables, and flowers. Did they ever shine so? When the character Pyramus was still alive, what did his face look like anyway? If Bottom is to be believed, then he played the role of Pyramus in a beard. The options from which he says he could choose are vibrant indeed: straw color, orange tawny, purple and grain, and French crown color, your perfect yellow. But we do not know which set of whiskers he selected for performance. If Peter Quince is to be believed, then Pyramus is a sweet-faced man, a proper man as one shall see in a summer's day, a most lovely, gentlemanlike man. Sonnet 18's "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day" is an intertext for Quince's appraisal. Like the beautiful young man whom the speaker of the first sonnet associates with beauty's rose, Pyramus is, in part, at least, a bouquet of flowers. Studying the role of Thisbe in the Athenian woods, Flute salutes most radiant Pyramus, and observes that Pyramus is most lily white of hue, of color like the red rose on triumphant briar. These paired flowers should appear, as they do in Shakespeare's Rape of Lucrece, in the fair faces field, that is, in the cheeks. It may be that the application to male bodies of roses and lilies, both of which are signs of female beauty in love poetry, inspired by the Song of Songs, and written in the wake of Petrarch, is a genderqueer technique. But in this respect, Pyramus is no special case. In Richard Barnfield's Affectionate Shepherd, white and red, quote, as the lily and the blushing rose, grows on the face of a boy named Ganymede, and the young man of Shakespeare's Sonnet 98 is celebrated as the pattern of lilies white and the deep vermilion in the rose. As Thisbe views him just after he's died, Pyramus differs also from his peers, both male and female, in the poetic tradition. She suggests that when Pyramus was alive, his face scrambled, regular patterns of beauty. The lilies should have been visible on his cheeks, but Thisbe remembers that they were on his lips. In her mourning, she makes no mention of the red rose that features in the script that Flute was practicing. In this memory, both flowers have been replaced on Pyramus's cheeks by the yellow cowslip, a sallow flower that may point back to the pallor of the lips. For its part, the cherry, which has been unlinked from its more typical correspondence with lips, and which Thisbe had already associated with her own lips when she neared the figure of Wall, once bedecked Pyramus's nose. Since this acting troupe's theatrical signature is comical disfigurement, we could regard Flute's turn as Thisbe as one more instance of inept acting. I want to resist this assessment and pose as a thought experiment the possibility that since the players do not rehearse this scene in the woods, Flute is not misspeaking lines in this moment. How then do we approach Pyramus's queerly arranged face if Flute as Thisbe hasn't gotten the script wrong? The leaks may be the clue to this approach. Lovers' discourses that are inspired positively by Petrarchism tend to employ in their idealizing and eroticizing descriptions of human beauty an array of flowers, because they too are beautiful and fragrant, fruits because they're succulent to the taste, and even garlands crafted out of tree branches because of the link between Laura and laurel. If a poet lover requires more substantial objects for praising the value of a body part, then he has recourse to stones and gems. But nowhere in a straight-faced blason have I found the virtue of the leek trumpeted. In this poetic tradition, the leek is not, to invoke Fluellen's phrase in Henry V, an honorable badge of service. The leeks are eyes in the blazon of that the leeks are eyes in the blazon of Pyramus's face may reinforce the fact that Bottom has bulbous vegetables on his mind earlier in midsummer. Just before the company leaves for Theseus' palace, he advises his fellow actors to eat no onions nor garlic, for we are to utter sweet breath, and I do not doubt but to hear them say, it is a sweet comedy. Even so, when the troupe has exited, the otherwise charitable, it's a strange phrase for me, the otherwise charitable Theseus calls the evening's entertainment a palpable, gross play. Forgoing garlic and onions didn't do the trick. There is a minor but striking subgenre of blazon that would readily accommodate in its descriptive rhythms palpable, gross vegetables like leeks, onions, and garlic. And my point here is that Midsummer draws on it to figure Pyramus's face. Heather Dubrow names it the ugly beauty tradition, and although the tradition has roots in classical oratory and medieval poetry, Dubrow helpfully regards its appearance in 16th and 17th century European verse as a counter-discourse to Petrarchism. In her analysis, the subgenres ostensibly comic tropes vector misogyny and racism. For example, one of Edward Gilpin's epigrams called Of Negrina depicts a woman with a, quote, winter cherry on her lips and her cheeks best fruits a black, no mulberry. Some of the poems in this tradition also employ vegetables to conjure the female body, and I argue that when they do so, they exhibit social bias. Here are 4 examples, well, 2 or 4, there's another slide, in which such garden variety vegetables feature in Renaissance blazons. Composed around 1523, Michelangelo's poem 20 depicts a woman with a face that is prettier than a turnip, teeth as white as parsnips, hair whiter and blonder than a leek. She has a mouth like a sack filled up with beans. No laughing. And breasts that look like 2 watermelons in a bag. A shepherd named Doran in Robert Greene's prose romance Menaphon sings that his beloved Carmela has lips that resemble to cowcumbers or cucumbers, fair. The speaker of John Donne's The Comparison observes of his mistress that, like a bunch of ragged carrots stand the short, swollen fingers of her gouty hand. And in a poem called The Description of 3 Beauties, which was published in 1655 and which has been attributed to Sir John Menis and James Smith, the speaker depicts the character Mopsa from Sidney's Arcadia, and I'll have a few things to say about her in a minute, as having saffron teeth and lips of leeks, as well as a neck of carrot. Beans, carrots, cucumbers, leeks, parsnips, and turnips in no way ennoble the mouth, the neck, the lips, the hair in the lips, the teeth, and the face's complexion. Gathered together as if in a homespun basket, these similes and metaphors express a de-idealizing and de-eroticizing earthiness. They attempt to transform these women, young and old alike, into culinary staples that their real-world counterparts cultivated in kitchen gardens, and that were then consumed at table in daily servings. Sir John Menis and James Smith, who are the least known authors listed in my survey, are also the ones who explicitly imitate the model of the most influential of English Renaissance poets, Sir Philip Sidney. For his part, Sidney had extended little kindness in the New Arcadia to the pastoral servant Mopsa. Surrounded by classical paintings and a royal family portrait, all of which are displayed in a gallery, a character called Calendar repeats by rote some unflattering verse that, quote, a pleasant fellow of my acquaintance set forth of Mopsa's praises. In this sonnet, Mopsa comes into view as an unsightly hodgepodge of colors and shapes. She has a hyacinth-like forehead, opal cheeks, sapphire lips, hair like crapplestone, which I think is the stone that sits in a toad's forehead, skin like burnished gold, and hands like silver ore untried. Sidney thus mocks the blazon tradition by framing Mopsa in one. In imitating Sidney, Menis and Smith replace the gems and metals of Mopsa's features with vegetables that are presumably more befitting so coarse a shepherdess. With his leek-like eyes and rearranged botanical face, Bottom's Pyramus keeps surprising aesthetic company with this class of low women, fruits, and vegetables. As Conrad Hilberry observed some time ago, the blason of Mopsa's face helped establish the ugly beauty tradition in English. Mopsa, whose blason is tellingly rehearsed in or near a picture gallery, and her literary kin in Sidney's writing may be foundational to the arts in yet another way. In her biography of Sidney, Catherine Duncan Jones detects in his verse mannerist effects and identifies as a possible source for them a diplomatic visit that Sidney made to Prague in 1577, where he may have viewed the paintings of the Habsburg court portraitist Giuseppe Arcimboldo. There you go. Among other commissions, which included fashioning heraldic blasons, Arcimboldo painted in the early 1560s a series of composed heads in profile called the Four Seasons, and here's summer. And these paintings were paired with another set that he completed in the mid-1560s called the Four Elements. Duplicate sets of both series were distributed across Europe as royal gifts. Sylvia Farino Pogden, who co-curated an exhibition on Arcimboldo that opened in 2007, writes that these portraits, this is a longer quote, create a surprise effect which takes the viewers unaware and bewilders them. The disoriented eye goes to and fro between the overall shape and the details until it finally identifies the trick, which gives rise to amusement, joy, or repulsion. These paintings famously repulsed Roland Barthes, and his rationale for why they generate this effect for him is illuminating in the context of the materials I explore. The paintings, he observes, attempt, quote, to intercept a metamorphosis, and its incompletion places on display a malaise of matter, a swarm. The blasons of Mopsa and her descendants, which jumble together verbal signs for a variety of shapes and colors, similarly flicker, in my mind at least, on the threshold of bodily conversion. If, then, we grant that Sidney's blason is Archimboldesque in its stylings, might Pyramus's face, or better yet, the script that captures it, likewise be? So far as I can tell, Pyramus's face is nowhere blasoned in this way in English translations of Ovid that date from the period. How do we have the capacity to see with Thisbe's eyes? Would we also witness in the dead face of a proper man as one shall see in a summer's day a different transformation, the loss of a sweet face akin to, but certainly not the same as, what another 20th century enthusiast of Arcimboldo called an anthropomorphic still life? In Eco-Critical Shakespeare, Robert N. Watson reads the blason of Pyramus's face and says that in it we, quote, encounter an Arcimboldo. It's probably summer. And Watson reproduces an image of summer in that chapter. This is Philip Paz's recreation of summer. That's my boyfriend. Both artworks evidence for Watson the, quote, interpenetration of ourselves with external nature. In broadest terms, we could say that one goal of the eco-critical project in Shakespeare studies in the last decade has been to recover and maybe even marvel at the outlines of an early modern ecosystemic human being whose interpenetration with and by an external nature feels, by more contemporary measures, queer. But as I hope to have shown, the signs through which early modern artists rendered such a body were never neutral. They marked differences in gender, class, and race. In the blasons and portraits I study, we glimpse one moment in a longer cultural genealogy that makes, sometimes only rhetorically, and sometimes literally, but always, I think, violently, certain bodies into fruits and vegetables. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's a beautiful day, Let's go for a ride. I begin with a familiar scene from Henry V. I will not change my horse, the Dauphin announces in Act 3, with any that treads but on 4 pasterns. Saha, he bounds from the earth as if his entrails were hares. Le cheval volant, the Pegasus, chez la narine de feu. When I bestride him, I soar, I am a hawk. He trots the air, the earth sings when he touches it. The basest horn of his hoof is more musical than the pipe of Hermes. The constable in Orléans tried to repress the Dauphin's exuberant idolatry, but only managed to spur him on to greater absurdities concerning this prince of palfreys. The Dauphin says, I once writ a sonnet in his praise and began it thus, wonder of nature. Orléans says, I have heard a sonnet begin so to one's mistress. Dauphin, then did they imitate that which I composed to my courser, for my horse is my mistress? Your mistress bears well. Me well, which is the prescript praise and perfection of a good and particular mistress. Nay, for me thought yesterday your mistress shrewdly shook your back. So perhaps did yours, says the Dauphin. Mine, says the constable, was not bridled. And on it goes. The scene descends from the heights of poetry into a testy body-prose exchange. Such critical attention as this passage has attracted generally confirms Peter Erikson's judgment that the Dauphin is here proven a, quote, travesty of masculinity that confirms the play's endorsement of muscular English heterosexuality. And indeed, the Dauphin's adoration of his equine partner seems to reflect, if not the fully bestializing erotic attachment that his companions hint at, then at least an infantile fixation on an inappropriate love object. Orléans and the constable quickly move this uncomfortable moment toward more suitable ground, jokes about prostitutes, the missionary position, sexual diseases that substitute allusions to human mistresses for the love between a man and his equine mount. In other words, their banter deflects the discussion away from the Dauphin's improper and troubling celebration of his palfrey, what Mel Wai-Chen might call his improper affiliation, and these indiscreet indulgences in an unacceptable kind of intimate bond. They react to his orientation toward the animal with their defensive, reorienting conversational interventions. For them, the animal must be either merely a conveyance or a metaphor through which heterosexual desire can be discursively invoked. That is, they want to restore a degree of marginality or transparency and thus invisibility to the lauded horse. Sexual orientation, Sarah Ahmed argues, is a matter of how we reside in space, of how and who or what we inhabit spaces with, and what habitual actions shape our bodies and worlds. To orient oneself is, as she puts it, to turn toward objects that, quote, help us find our way. If we think with and through orientation, Ahmed suggests, quote, we might allow moments of disorientation to gather. Queer objects might take us to the very limits of social gathering, even when they still gather us around. So I think that any reading of the palfrey episode in Henry V that tries to plot it on a rigid axis of masculine-feminine, or even hetero-homoerotic or bestial-human, would only cooperate with Orléans and the constable in limiting the objects and bodies that the Dauphin queerly prefers to gather or affiliate with. If our critical attention does not resist the process of erotic normalization, that is, if we take him lightly, refuse to give his speech any real weight, we risk straightening out the scene and overlooking the more provocative, perhaps disorienting nature of the Dauphin's relationship. So in this paper, I intend to take the Dauphin's claims about his horse, like Donald Trump, both seriously and literally, to offer an outline for a prospective queer phenomenology of the human-equine encounter. And so instead of examining the social, economic, political, or other inscriptions and meanings of the Dauphin's mount, my talk today attempts to answer a different question. And here I slightly misquote Elizabeth Gross, quote, what is it in the nature of equine bodies that opens them up to cultural transcription, social immersion, and production? What material aspects of the human-equine encounter might explain the frequency and extent to which, as in the Dauphin's case, equine bodies colonize or usurp the erotic positions, roles, or imagined subjectivities usually ascribed to human partners? What is this marvelous and compelling equine body the Dauphin so disconcertingly turns toward and so lovingly anatomizes in a passionate sonnet that might make it somehow natural for him to do all of that? And I'm going to confess that, like any horse This one ran away with me, and I ended up with about a 38-page paper. So in the longer version of the paper, I address size and shape and number and temperature and movement. Today, I only have time for 2 of these attributes. You can be grateful, that structure human and equine physiology and cognition, shape and movement. So shape and movement. Shape. When the Dauphin names his animal a palfrey, or a courser, he evokes a very specific image. A palfrey was usually a smaller horse than the destrier battle mount, and was usually considered more beautiful, with a rounded, compact baroque figure and musculature that made it capable of a smoother lateral gait. The standard for the palfrey's beauty is everywhere confirmed in treatises on riding and breeding. Michael Barrett, for instance, describes the ideal handsome horse as one with ribs that, quote, bear out in rotundity like a barrel, and he requires it also to be round-backed, while Thomas Blundeville prefers the Neapolitan to the Spanish genet because the latter's, quote, buttocks are somewhat slender. And generally he approves animals that are, quote, full of muscles or brawns of flesh with short backs and great round buttocks. In Jarvis Markham's advice to horse purchasers, he refers again and again to the many swellings, that's his word, that comprise a perfect equine form. Quote, see that the breast be broad outswelling, that the animal have, quote, outswelling forethigh, and its hindquarters likewise be thick, brawny, full, and swelling. Roundness, then, is the quality of shape that defines an aesthetically pleasing, valuable, and healthy animal. Certainly, Renaissance sculpture and painting revel in the sensuous, fleshy curves of a horse's body, focusing as obsessively on round shapes as do the treatise authors. Kenneth Clark claimed this feature distinguished Renaissance from medieval art, observing that, quote, the splendid curves of energy in these paintings of horses, the neck and rump united by the passive curve of the belly and capable of infinite variations from calm to furious strength, are without question the most satisfying piece of formal relationship in nature. We could read this focus on the beauty of curvaceous posteriors as a manufactured cultural preference, one that grows out of the prior distinction or class associations of the breeds in question. But there's another way to think about all these swellings and roundnesses. Barrett in particular insists on the role of geometry in determining the perfection of the horse's physical being. And indeed, the curve represented a monumental challenge to early modern mathematicians. It was only in the 17th century that analytic geometry established a formula to elegantly describe one. That's actually Cartesian coordinates. A humanist achievement in charting God's elemental design of the cosmos. So Barrett's references to geometry thus situate the curvy equine as the epitome of divine order. Current work in neuroscience suggests that the attraction, perhaps even the erotic magnetism of curves for the human observer, may in fact be hardwired in the human brain. The University of Toronto psychologist Orshan Vartanian conducted a series of experimental brain scans involving variously curved objects and found that, quote, our preference for curves cannot be explained entirely in terms of a cold cognitive assessment of the qualities of curved objects. Curvature appears to affect our feelings, which in turn drives our preference. Such a bias toward curves may have evolutionary origins, he actually suggests that, in our avoidance of sharp objects. But whatever the origin, the bias is linked to affective stimulation. And equine curves present a viewer or a rider with a range of affordances that telegraph the potential pleasures of human equine anatomical engagement. The fleshy roundnesses, those fatty and muscular swellings Markham dwells on, both mirror and complement a rider's own curving anatomical structures. They invite hands, eyes, and legs to linger, to touch, to assert pressure, or surrender space to another's form. Curves, we might say, are thus primordial visceral sources of relational and erotic gratification. Motion. The Dauphin's adulation of his horse extends to its musical hoof, which he says makes the very earth sing in response to its touch. Elizabeth Le Guin has compared the training of horse and rider to musical education, noting that the achievement of perfect kinesthetic harmony between these two distinct bodies requires the same coordination and synchronized rhythm as does playing an instrument. So William Cavendish, for instance, uses the analogy of lute playing to illustrate the, quote, good music that good horsemanship produces. Quote, he that has not a musical head, Cavendish concludes, can never be a good horseman. The several gaits of the horse, the walk, trot, canter, and gallop, and the variations in breed, size, and shape require a repertoire of riderly adaptations to different cadences. And Le Guin points out that in the production of an artistic equine ballet, it is the horse's bodily intelligence that calls the tune. So that if the rider does not listen, she says, that is, follow and enhance the motion with his own corporeal discipline, the result will be forced and effortful. Supplemented movement, such as that made possible by an equine partner, is, however, a remarkably queer thing. Through riding, relatively slow human bipedal propulsion is swapped for quadrupedal speed, which can be suddenly adjusted, its direction and rhythm modified in an instant, allowing huge alterations in the experience of time and distance. Early modern literary examples of equine movement that perplex the usual rational frameworks for recognizing relative speed include the problem of how, for instance, Spenser's Red Cross Knight and Una can travel at apparently irreconcilably disparate speeds. Right? He pricks or spurs swiftly across a plain while she rides slowly behind him with her dwarf, and yet somehow the two of them always remain together. The knight, the image affirms in Spenser, lives in rapid martial bursts determined by his mount's collected or extended speed. Una moves instead at a lithic pace like the rock she stands for allegorically. Yet this kind of interpretation relies on the undergirding material fact of the relative and variable velocities of which horses are capable. To experience breathless speed on horseback involves entering the alien space and time in which an equid naturally dwells. At the core of Hotspur's rash, impatient nature in 1 Henry IV, for instance, is his identification with his mount, a creature through which his desire to meet and conquer how, quote, hot horse to horse, is ultimately triangulated. Equally, when Sidney's Musidorus, the Arcadia's masterful centaur-like horseman, first appears, riding the mast of his wrecked ship out of the sea, quote, as if on horseback, we are invited to recognize that riding implicates human bodies in an unfamiliar and even hostile material environment. Like sailing or swimming, riding a horse requires human adaptation to the pulse of a foreign medium, the swell and retreat of waves corresponding to the complex tempo of equine gaits. A horse is, as the Dauphin insists, a theme as fluent as the sea. And like the ocean, riding can result in shipwreck. Steve Mentz locates a marine element in the Dauphin dolphin's protean name and playful nature that gestures toward the possibility of a more than earthbound future for humanity. I think Mentz would agree, though, I know he would agree, that oceanic equine motion can be dangerous, right? The Dauphin, for instance, takes a tumble, not from his horse, but from the heights of its accomplishments expressed in poetry, dragged down into earthbound prose during the pun-filled exchange imposed by Orleans and the Constable. The Dauphin tries to bring his companions down with him. He parries the Constable's joking reference to a bridled and so presumably more proper female human sexual partner by warning, "They that ride so and ride not warily fall into foul bogs. I had rather have my horse to my mistress." The descent of the conversation into scurrility reproduces the sexually corrupt fallen state of mankind that makes such a descent inevitable. Human mistresses, bridled or not, can still pass along diseases in their, quote, foul bogs. But in hinting that the Constable's mistress will give him the clap, the Dauphin, too, has taken a catastrophic spill, one that has shattered that transcendent rhetorical union he was establishing with his beloved mount. A rider can be elevated by his horse, he can be carried above the earth, defying gravity aboard a Pegasus or a Bucephalus, matching the light fall of its hoofbeats with his supple hip and hand, but the unwary or unskilled rider might also plunge earthward, coming down like glistering Phaeton, as Richard II puts it, to end up as, quote, bemoiled, as is Kate in The Taming of the Shrew, when she tumbles down a, quote, foul hill and is pinned under her mount. Shakespeare, Sidney, and Spenser all unhorse any number of characters to demonstrate their internal, often sexual disorder. Demetus in the Arcadia, in the Fairy Queen, Paradelle, Scudamore, Sanglier, and Archimago, in Shakespeare, both Richards, Talbot, Kate, and Falstaff, and probably dozens of others. Falls like these punctuate early modern literature to illustrate human failures of control over the passions. The horses involved, therefore, primarily bear the burden of human exceptionalist ideologies. But again, refusing to account for the embodied experiences on which these ideologies are built risks erasing the phenomenological engagement between equine and human that makes ideology possible and meaningful. A fall is also always simply a fall, a sudden physical return to a limited, frail, vulnerable body at the mercy of its mount's footing. Perhaps the most famous fall in early modern literature is Montaigne's, recounted in his essay on practice. Out riding one day on his undemanding but not very reliable horse, one of his men, mounted on a huge, quote, fresh and vigorous farm horse, ends up crashing like a colossus or a thunderbolt into Mantegna, who refers to himself as a small man on a small horse. Horse and rider are upended, and Mantegna is nearly killed. I'm sure you all know this episode. The event prompts Mantegna's reflection on the body's independent agency and mobility when it tries to save itself as it falls, and he draws a direct line between its flailing gestures and autonomous sexual arousal. Quote, "Every man," he remarks, "knows that he has a part of his body which often stirs, erects, and lies down again without his leave." Overpowered and unhorsed, struck by lightning and reminded of his small stature by a colossus, Mantegna undergoes a kind of life-threatening coitus interruptus that imagines both horse and human bodies to be alien and hostile environments. So to conclude, literary texts like Henry V involve what Ahmed might call a kind of social gathering of readers, of characters, of described, implied, and present bodies. What we choose to turn toward or away from limits the kinds of phenomenological engagements we recognize and value. By refusing to allow the constable in Orléans to limit the participants at this gathering, by entering and occupying the territory of the Dauphin's erotic delight in his mount, we might instead acknowledge the qualities that make the horse, to slightly misquote the Dauphin, a wonder of queer nature. Thank you.
You guys make a tough act to follow, a series of tough acts to follow. I want to start, of course, by thanking Karen for organizing this unruly group, and also thanks to the SAA leadership. I want to mention Lena in particular for their efforts to foster new work. I'm certainly very grateful to have a chance to address a conference that has meant so much to me as a space for conversation over the years. I've tweaked my subtitle, as is the prerogative of speakers, to Asking Questions with Sonnet 18. I open with some questions to set up possible horizons for Sonnet 18's own opening question, especially insofar as that famous first line asks what kind of relation holds between the beloved and his larger environment or cosmos. Because two more general queries take vivid shape here in the critical focus enabled by our increasingly ecological attention. First, is humanity to be considered as an included part of nature, however we decide to define that? And you might as well see nature with a capital N throughout the talk. Is humanity to be considered as an included part of nature, or should a certain separation be observed to reflect nature's historical, cultural, and conceptual quality? This question of human exceptionalism is a traditional enough knotty problem, from theology to ecological and evolutionary theory and history to epistemology to moral philosophy. But Shakespeare's poem asks it with unusual directness, even simplicity. Second question, does queerness, again, however we decide to define that, pertain exclusively to human domains and phenomena or not? How might the anti-identitarian trajectories of queerness, brilliantly elaborated originally around overwhelmingly human questions of sexuality, desire, and affect, address the operations of nature or even describe something about the cosmos itself? Does the application of queer concepts to non-human things, for example, anthropomorphize those things? Or should queer capacity be numbered among those other old chestnuts, reason, language, a soul, and tool use, as an assertion of species privilege now susceptible to exposure as species myopia? Depending on the answer to that question, sub-questions proliferate. If queerness indexes a sexuality or an affect or a kind of unbound free movement that carries an exclusively human signature, if it moves against nature or despite it, or outside it, or above it, how would we now name a unique source or origin for it? What governs its structure or expression? Alternatively, if queerness is not only human and human only, but instead a general law or a relatively distributed way of acting or unfolding, how then might we reckon with a nature that can be said also to possess or express it? If nature is neither normative itself, nor a reliable guarantor of norms, what then? And if these preliminary branching queries of mine achieve nothing else, they highlight how much might have to be stipulated even to form working definitions for the dauntingly high concept and flamboyantly contingent terms, humanity, queerness, nature. But we can surely see how concatenating a role exceptionality will play. When humanity is cast as exceptional, is it thereby unnatural? Is that humanity a freak of nature, perhaps the queerest of all the species, or maybe even the only queer one? At stake in these tail-chasing questions, I think, is how rediagramming the relations among humanity, queerness, and nature might impact our broad notion of laws, especially insofar as these notions derive from ideas of natural regularity. Correspondingly, our metrics for exceptional or deviant phenomena, or what might, at the right scale, just be an incompleteness in any given law's scope, might need to change. Put yet another way, the historical association between queerness and the unnatural could loosen, opening a space for what I hope to be able to call a natural history of human being. And so, the question towards which mine all wend their way: shall I compare thee to a summer's day? For now, maybe that is the question. By opening an inquiry into what relation can be said to hold between the beloved and a summer's day, even in this sweetest of sonnets, the poet takes up a hard question about humanity's relation to the cosmos, our place, as Lear dramatically phrases it, beneath the extremity of the skies. Sonnet 18 moves to a less violently adversarial climate to pose this existential query, but clearly rough winds persist. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Not can I, or even should I, but shall I? Half-idly, perhaps posing a question of the purest choice among abounding options, perhaps marking it as daring, the speaker ponders his poetic power to make two things like, and the aptness of one likening in particular. Must the two things already be unlike for a poet to liken them? Or do they have to be alike enough already to share some common denominator or participate together in a larger matrix for comparison to hold? The answer to this shall I would seem to be not just a no, but a cascade of them, as the sonnet inventories an insufficiency of likeness. Put to the test, the summer's day trope notoriously lacks integrity. It turns up more contrast than comparison. If a summer's day proverbially, and it's Tilly S967, the one that you were also referencing, if a summer's day proverbially evokes the most singularly lovely and temperate form or event in nature, it still falls short of that eternal summer in line 9 that is already attributed to the beloved, oddly enough, even before the sonnet fulfills its compensatory labor to eternize him. The familiar cadences of the poem proceed to arraign the summer nature makes as too flimsy for the task at hand. Since rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and sometimes the sun shines either too hot or too little, his gold complexion dimmed, a whole range of adverse qualities far too easily intrude on natural summer, on summer itself, on summer as such. Meanwhile, summer's own sweet properties constitutionally can't withstand cyclical change or the foreclosures of time. The problem with summer's lease is not only that it has all too short a date, but that it has any end date, any terminus at all. The summer's day, then, systematically lacks that right stuff for this work. Of course, we can note immediately that negative or failed comparisons, in their way, serve no worse than apt ones. Indeed, perhaps the elaborately failed comparison works optimally, proving the speaker-lover's painful bias that, as the song goes, nothing compares to you. The poet seeks to remove the beloved from our sublunary world and fix him above those skies whose downward force Lear laments as the pressing weight that mints us human. Then, at the sonnet's halfway mark, perhaps things get a little more tangled. Line 7 broadly announces what sounds like a general principle or law of nature. Every fair from fair sometime declines. Sometime, or sometimes, that is, once or occasionally, are common variants, as Stephen Booth points out very consequentially for this line. What scope or jurisdiction pertains to the scientific proposition that every fair sometimes declines? Clearly, the sonnet aims for a place outside of that jurisdiction, and that may have to mean outside of everything, since the generality governs every fair. But what queer kind of unnorming law of nature is it, exactly, to pronounce that every fair thing sometimes is not fair? In another context, I've outlined the case for a queer rain in King Lear, suggesting that the play's torrential storm opens the prospect of a cosmos that is either unhinging or allowing us humans a disturbing glimpse of the unsettled nature of its laws. Our puny human scale prevents sure knowledge of the difference between those choices. While early modern things, from basic elements to the assembled bodies they compose, have describable natures or generally operative characters, they unfold in performances that are always open to waywardness and invention. Thus, we have the rich phrase that's come up in the subtext of a number of the talks today, nature's bias. In Shakespeare and elsewhere, where references to bowling invoke the inbuilt swerves and obliquities inhering in things, the curvature that Karen's talking about might be part of this conversation. Montaigne would remark further that superseding accidents would knock him clean out of that right bias. A paradoxically right bias of things, which we might gloss as some sort of queered rule or arcing square, does not govern those things very absolutely, let alone regularly. Nature, in other words, does not preside in the homogeneous and unbroken manner conventionally attributed to its abstraction as an inexorable law of nature, which should fully encompass the possible, and so be impossible to violate or fail or exceed. Richard Hooker's 1593 Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity spells out an orthodox vision of the fixed order alleged for nature. Doesn't show any horses there, but clearly he should have. Even there, a persistent anxiety dogs even that magisterial articulation of a law for nature and ordered nature. God, Hooker expounds, riffing the homilies, made a law for the rain, and decreed unto the sea that the waters should not pass his commandment. Given this edict settling the world into limiting, bounded identities, Hooker asks a longer rhetorical question. if nature should intermit her course and leave altogether the observation of her own laws, if those principal elements whereof all things in this lower world are made should lose the qualities which they now have, if the frame of that heavenly ark erected over our heads should loosen and dissolve itself, if the celestial spheres should forget their wonted motions and turn themselves any way as it might happen, if the moon should wander from her beaten way, what then? And what would become of man himself, whom all these things do now serve, unquote. For Hooker, the establishment of nature's law, its assignment of qualities to elements, provides what he calls, quote, the stay of the whole world. But the addressee of this natural guarantee that things will keep their courses and stay in their places is the creature they are all alleged to serve, man himself, the focal point, or perhaps the vanishing point, of this gargantuan legal fiction. Calling Hooker's what-if question, in King Lear the whole world wobbles. Without its stays, it is unstayed. In the gentler climes of Sonnet 18, however, we can see the same wobble register in the smaller compass of its 14 lines. If every fair from fair sometime declines, it seems nature, in Hooker's words, might intermit her course. For it is one thing for nature to chart or script a course of change, of cyclical or seasonal movement, of growth and decay for one thing and another. That wraps mutability in a familiar guise. But it is quite another thing for nature to change its own course and wander from her beaten way. Here, along with the poem, I proceed to line 8. Fair things decline from fairness, it explains, when they are, quote, by chance or nature's changing course, untrimmed. The odd adjective, untrimmed, has multiple, if oblique, senses. Holiday settings are trimmed when arrayed with ornaments and decorations. An untrimmed tree evokes one stripped of its leaves in the northern autumn. But as Catherine Duncan Jones Arden notes explain, a nautical sense also suggests unadjusted sails and the asymmetries of ballast that can set a ship's course slanting akimbo, a giant preference for the curve, perhaps. Just like the weight or the bias set inside the ball in bowls. Between a traditional inherent or hardwired mutability, which proceeds in a regular manner, and the ideal of eternality towards which the poem notionally strives, another prospect looms here, the sport or jagged course, chance or accident, nature's swerve or bias, a surprise in the unfolding or direction of a natural course. In this way, to be untrimmed is to be redirected by nature's changing course. And when nature can change or intermit that course, as this line admits to possibility, perhaps there we can catch our glimpse of a queer capacity in nature. But since we cannot say whether this owes to a radical freedom in nature, or just the unfolding of some law too big or too remote for us puny creatures to grasp, the queerness in nature, perhaps nature's prerogative, may also coincide with the limits of human knowledge. And what about the fair beloved, whose locales we are also recalculating, and the poet's hopes to eternize him? Many of us teach Sonnet 18 as the most optimistic sonnet, full of poetic confidence. I know I do. I know I have. But in the shadow of current debates concerning the time now being called the Anthropocene, its effective dates, its global scope, the scope of human complicity, how shared is that? it seems worth attending to the poem's vision of the human species and pose Hooker's question again. What becomes of man himself? Though the summer's day trope wanes for lack of likeness, it isn't true that nothing compares to the beloved in the poem. What of the other people in the poem? The men who breathe like him and have eyes. The sonnet's uplifting couplet, affirming the power of verse, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee, registers at the species level not so much pure confidence as a nagging caveat. So long as men can breathe. We all ask now, how long is that? While I would not go quite so far as to say the hesitation, so long as, fully imagines what we might now call an extinction event, the poem does know that it does not know how long the human race can be counted on to persist, let alone to read poetry. The oblivion that was feared first and foremost for the beloved lurks for humankind itself in the couplet, which only relocates the problem of his preservation to the species level as a common risk. Either way, it turns out, endurance and extinction, endurance or extinction alike, will be calibrated collectively. In this glimmer of the possibility of a future without us, the couplet finds a way to remind us that beneath the extremity of the skies, tossed by rough winds even in springtime, we huddle in this predicament that we really might want to consider keeping on calling humanity together. Thanks.
Okay, so we do have a few minutes for questions. Again, there's a microphone. If speaking into the microphone is not to your taste, it's probably best to stand up and sing out, Louise, so we can hear you. I also just any question is appreciated, but I think I would particularly appreciate questions that somehow engage the whole panel. But of course, any questions. So yes, Valerie.
Hi, I'm Valerie Traub. I have a question for Vin. Well, first off, thank you all for, that was a fantastic panel. I'm just thrilled. A question for Vin and Karen, and that's inspired by Joseph's wonderful reminder of the tensions that are alive within a queer analytic, and your use, Joseph, of the hive as a way of positing what's at stake in the queer appraisal of human and non-human interactions. So my question focuses on the figure of the ground. Vin's earthy vegetables are all root vegetables, which grow mainly below the ground, and you actually have to pile up soil to keep leeks properly white, right? And Karen's horses, thank you, those were just fantastic images. For all their curves and kinesthetic intelligence, sometimes have to struggle to rise up off the ground. Something that I've also always noticed with my horses is the one moment when they don't seem like God's most magnificent creatures. And so I'm wondering if the ground is perhaps another figure for an important limit space that structures, for instance, the form of the vegetables, the functionality of equine movement, which would not happen without that, the legs on the ground, and also their relationship to humans. And I'm wondering how a queer ecological view of the ground might push against some really old assumptions about the ground as soil, as in soilage, as in dirt or stain or corruption, while also insisting on the kind of material specificity of power relations that Joseph, I thought, brought beautifully to the fore.
I know, right? It's a gorgeous question, and I think it beautifully connects Karen's paper and mine. And, okay, I'll try harder. I think it's a gorgeous question, and I think it beautifully sort of makes a link among three of the papers. And what's so interesting to me about the question as I think about it is how something theoretically like the swarm requires an airborneness. And Val's question is precisely about a kind of earthiness or groundedness. And you know, I think that the desire to be airborne is it may be like one of the queerest fantasies because of lack of capacity, right? And so for me, the groundedness is a reminder not just of a kind of humanness, sort of the humus of the human, but also about how we're grounded collectively and differentially. And I think that those are two important things to keep in mind. I'll stop now and pass on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question and an important part of the framework in which you would want to understand probably all of these papers at some level. And I don't have a whole lot to add except that to emphasize that the fantasy of being airborne is precisely what's at stake in the Dauphin's speech, in parts of it that I didn't even get to cover, and in a number of the treatises, as well as the evolving practice of horsemanship, that this is precisely the fantasy of not being earthbound. And those moments of unhorsing are the return to kind of the material conditions that the animal imposes, right? The animal itself is earthbound, as Val noted, and there's only a fantasy involved, which can be rudely interrupted, usually displaced onto characters who somehow don't merit becoming elevated, and yet it's not a problem that only applies to those characters. So that's one of the ways in which things like class and race, et cetera, get offered and sort of are contained, but then the containment fails at some level, right?
Sorry, I'll say just something very quickly, and I know there are other questions. I couldn't help but thinking during Valerie's lovely question about Paul Monet's poem Gardenias, and the question of sort of visibility and exposure having different stakes. And there, a poem very much about the very, very long history in which sort of floral imagery figures a certain kind of conversation about sexuality, but the sort of bulbs of flowers and that sort of phrase, sour secret hidden in the mine of pain. And he's talking about extraordinary loss, but also a question about that unfurling, which may not be simply, say, humanist exceptionalist extension through fantasy, but also the visibility of particular kinds of desire and sexuality.
Actually,
I've got my okay. Is this one working? Yeah. Just to pop a tiny note onto that, in connection with the requirement of earth under our feet to keep us standing up, our famous upright posture, there's also, if you think about natural history as in love with the enumeration of bodily specs of all the creatures, one can think not only of our notorious lack of a tail, but the sheer absence of wings on the human body poses such a colossal logical problem from the standards of point of view of perfection, and what is enabled by one part or another. Our wing envy might be another topic, marking a deficit. Right?
Yes.
It's Bruce Smith. I want to add my thanks. I'm sure I speak for everybody in the room saying that this was truly exhilarating. And I was also appreciating the irony that one of the most sterile environments one can imagine for hearing papers like this is being in a hotel for 3 days like this, where you can't even see a tree, and all of the food is dead before, anyway. Okay. This question actually follows from Laurie, I think, yours. And it comes out of a personal experience when I was hiking, when I taught at Georgetown, went out to the Shenandoah National Park, was hiking solo in a really remote place and had an encounter with a bear that was eating honey out of a rotted log. There was no way for me to escape. It was a successful encounter, but I think that we face an extreme situation when we think about animals that could not, when we think about natural things that we have no control over and that could eat us, which is not something that, it's an extreme, it puts us in an extreme situation. And I guess my question is this: I realize in thinking about that episode, there's no way that I can really put what happened into language or how the bear and I successfully negotiated this encounter, but I have thought about rhetoric, and I thought that there was a certain kind of metonymy that happened between us. But my question is this: if you think about thinking about this in queer terms, what do you think a queer trope or a queer mode of rhetoric would be for describing these relationships beyond simile and metaphor, which were very rife in the papers that you so wonderfully presented? Is that too perverse a question?
It's a hard question.
I think I better retire here.
Exit pursued by a bear.
That's a safe strategy.
Maybe I can sort of just, I feel like I should say something because there's honey involved, but I don't know if I have anything to say. Maybe I should ask, maybe one kind of question is, what's the urgency to move beyond simile and metaphor? Only because I think languages of making accomplish all sorts of interesting things. And so I don't know if that would get us to something either more queer or more real necessarily. All right, I don't know what to say. I'm a poet. I really love metaphors. So I'm probably the wrong person to answer this question.
I just was wondering about, thinking about the English equivalence in Putnam of the disruptor.
Yeah.
And thinking about it's not just putting it across rhetorically to make it more effective. I'm just thinking about the interface of language, human language, with the very phenomena that we're talking about.
So what if we stop thinking in terms of human language? What if we stop thinking in terms of speech and instead thought about rhetorics of the body, rhetorics that are completely alien to the ways in which we communicate? I think we could probably assume that that's exactly what happened between you and the bear, was that you spoke a language you don't even know you speak. That would be incredibly queer, wouldn't it? Yeah? Ha, I answered the question. It was an obvious answer.
Well, we are almost out of time. Maybe we can take a few minutes from the coffee break for those who would like to stay. Maybe the two very quick questions from the two speakers. Yeah, go ahead.
Quick. Horses, hives, and humans. My question has to do with the idea that in biology, what is human is a moving target. Other animals use tools. It appears they have language. They even have consciousness. How does that relate to, horses and hives have to be different for us to discuss them. How does that relate to the idea of what is human in all of your papers?
Just to give that to take a stab at it, part of what I hope becomes possible, not just by this work, but by the work of a variety of sort of areas of research that could be race, it could be nation, it could be religion as well. We might, in the wake of all that work, be able to think of the human again, go back in some ways, that's what I'm trying to do now, and let that creature stand in front of us in a sufficiently defrocked condition from the ideological inheritance that begins, way before the work we're talking about, and enable us to see it at least with the same sort of comfort and provisionality that we know there are horses or that we know there are vegetables. all ontologies are accordion-like, and one sets the boundaries wherever one sets it for whatever particular purpose. But I think that it's the horrific grandiosity of the kind of claims that have been associated with humanness and humanity that we now not only need to move away from, we're all doing that all the time, but we need also to not move so fast that we leave it as a category more deconstructed than, say, the category of the bee or the flower. I'd like to figure out a way to be sufficiently willing to talk about humans, bears, for those purposes. It's kind of much more natural, historical, and in some ways anti-philosophical approach, although I hope it's informed by a philosophical desire.
I'll just say very quickly, I think, too, there's something interesting as I read these bee books. The thing that of the many things I love so much about them, every time there's an attempt to sort of categorize politically what's happening in a hive, there's a fascinating kind of pushback, so that the hive isn't merely sort of a convenient metaphor for what's already happening in sort of human polity, nor vice versa, nor is it simply there's a one-to-one, this idealized hive sort of nature thing, right, that we can imitate. There's a constant pushing back. As soon as it seems like a human institution, there's something that sort of resists it. Or, yes, it's naturally true that the drones are pushed out, but what exactly do you do with that, since it doesn't seem to quite fit in all of the paradigms that sort of associate with it? And I think that interplay gives us a much richer account of the human, which I think also was one of the hopes of so much of the work on ecology and animals, which was that would happen.
Would you like to take one final question? Is that okay?
Thank you.
Okay, final question.
Evelyn Gajowski, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I'll be very brief. It's not even a question, it's just a comment. Helen Caldecott read Sonnet 18 at Stanford University back in the 80s when nuclear war was a palpable reality under Ronald Reagan. And I found myself sitting in the background, at the back of the auditorium, just sobbing because of this radically new meaning to Sonnet 18 that had never occurred to me in my life till then. And Laurie, I just wanted to thank you for doing the same thing today for me and for everybody. I thank Karen for organizing the panel, every one of you for your wonderful papers. I thought Bruce's adjective was wonderful, exhilarating. And thanks to the Board of Trustees for making this a plenary session.
Indeed, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.